Hello, and welcome to Follow Your Curiosity, where we explore the ups and downs of the creative process and how to keep it moving. I'm your host, Nancy Norbeck. I am a writer, singer, improv comedy newbie, science fiction geek, and creativity coach who loves helping right-brained folks get unstuck. I am so excited to be coming to you with interviews and coaching calls to show you the depth and breadth both of creative pursuits and creative people, to give you some insight into their experiences and to inspire you. Welcome to the second year of Follow Your Curiosity. Before we get started, I want to thank all of you who've come along with me since I started the show last January, and to welcome those of you who are just discovering the podcast. This show is a labor of love, and I'm so grateful to all of you who've supported me and helped me get the word out. Just one quick reminder, reviews over at Apple Podcasts do a lot more than you probably think to help new people find the show, so please do leave one. Thanks so much. Because this is the time of year when a lot of us start thinking about new projects, I wanted to talk to Kate Hutcheson, a project manager and virtual assistant for creative folks. That might sound like a contradiction in terms, which is exactly why I wanted to talk to her. A lot of us are afraid of anything that sounds like it might be too linear or box us into someone else's idea of how a project should work because we think it'll destroy everything that makes that project unique, interesting, and fun. And if it's not fun anymore, why would we do it? Kate has a lot to say about how planning actually frees up the energy we need to make things happen and how it helps you break the scary stuff into manageable parts. We also talked about how our perceptions of our creative abilities can be skewed, how guilt gets in our way, and even how tough it can be to claim the word creative for ourselves in the first place. I think you'll find a lot to chew on in this conversation with Kate Hutcheson. Kate, thanks for talking to me today. I'm totally curious to hear your story because I know that there's a story of your creative journey and how it landed you where you are now. So start at the beginning or wherever makes the most sense to start.
Okay. Hey, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to talk to you and to get to know you better. I feel like we've crossed paths and I don't really know you. So this is really exciting to me to get to have a conversation with you. In terms of like my story, like I don't have something kind of codified, where it's like,
That's okay.
It all started back when, blah, blah, blah. But I can say, so I recently was talking to a friend of mine who is, she's getting her, she's studying to be a therapist.
Mm-hmm.
Basically. And she was doing a course in people who, she was doing a course in like careers, how you find a career. And she wanted to talk to me because I own my own business.
Mm-hmm.
And so she was asking me all these questions about like schooling and, what I studied and how it informed kind of what I ended up doing with my life. And there's so much of it that you don't even realize until you're talking to somebody about it. And
sure.
You think like, oh, that's kind of how it all fits together. And so like, even as recently, it's like you're always, I think when you're an entrepreneur, you're constantly, there's so much kind of self-discovery that goes along with the process of starting your own business, that you're constantly in that sort of self-discovery mode where you're realizing things that, oh, I did this when I was 3 and, this is how it fits in. And I never had any idea, there's just all that stuff. So that's all to say, I don't feel like I really have a story, but, the short version is that I've always been more creative. Well, and I even struggle to say that, right? Mm-hmm. Like I remember I had a job where the people I worked with would say, "Oh, you're so creative," and I really I would say, "No, I'm not. I'm not creative." "Yes, you are. You're so creative," and I would say, I'm not creative. Here, no, I'm not creative. I'm imaginative, but I'm not creative. And I had to make that distinction. Because for me, it was important to make the distinction because I was like, well, I'm not creative because I don't actually make anything. I don't create anything. I'm imaginative because I could live in my own fantasy world forever and be totally happy there, or come up with certain ideas or things like that, but I'm not creative. But now, I realize like, well, these are kind of silly distinctions. No, I'm a creative person.
I know so many people who do that, who are like, oh, no, I'm not the creative one. I'm not the creative. It's like, are you breathing? That you're creative.
Yeah. But it's all like,
but it's hard.
And it's in that, that same sort of vein as like imposter syndrome, right? Mm-hmm. Where you feel like, well, I know so many people who are creative. And even now, like, yes, I've come to understand that, yes, I'm a creative person, but if I were to compare my creativity to that of my husband's, I would just pale in comparison. He is so creative. He's my, the person that I go to anytime I need, like, he's like a walking, what's the word I'm looking for? Brainstorm. He's a walking brainstorm session. You go to him and he's like having 12 people in the room, all having ideas, and they just like flow out of him so easily. Mm-hmm. All these ideas. And then I'm the one who like takes them and says, well, that's not going to work and that's not going to work, but that could work,
Can I just say something that I learned about this not that long ago? Cause I took a whole bunch of interesting tests, that kind of like tell you how your brain works. And one of them was rate of idea flow. So they give you this total nonsense prompt and a certain amount of time. And it's like how much stuff you produce in that amount of time. And so what they're very careful to tell you is that it doesn't actually say anything except like how you best function in a different environment. It's not like if you're coming up with, say you have, 3 minutes, and in those 3 minutes, you come up with, 56 ideas, right? Which may be impossible. I don't know, but a lot. All that means is that you came up with 56 ideas. It doesn't mean they were 56 good ideas. Mm-hmm. They were 56 ideas. It could be that in those same 3 minutes, you come up with 2, but both of them are really good. Odds are good that if you're slower, that, the stuff you're going to come up with is probably going to work better because a little more thought has gone into it. It's taken you a little bit longer to get there. So sorry for interrupting. I just felt like the need to point out that if people think that they're not creative because it takes them longer to come up with something, it has nothing to do with the quality of the ideas. It's just the rate. And beyond that, it doesn't say anything at all about you.
Yeah. Well, when my husband and I talk about it, we call it, there's 2 like phrases that we used to talk about it, but the one that we talk about the most is like a shotgun. We say it's a shotgun approach, mm-hmm. right? Where it's just like, there's 100 ideas and, and they're all just going everywhere in all kinds of different directions, but then you see what sticks.
Right.
So it's sort of like a shotgun that would shoot. Because like you like throw it at the wall and see what sticks, right? So it's like mixing metaphors.
Yeah,
like the shotgun shot pasta.
I'm also kind of thinking like, the metaphor that comes to mind for me is the fire hose, right? It's just wham, it's all there, but it's not all gonna go where you want it to go.
Yeah. So this has turned into sort of like, am I creative? Am I not creative? I don't know.
Right. You're breathing. It's okay.
Yeah. Right. I know. Well, I love that. And I think that that's really true. But I did fight against that idea, for a long time, even though I wouldn't have put myself on the other side of whatever spectrum there is. Mm-hmm. Right. Because I was always into the humanities, right? It was writing and it was poetry and, drawing and the, the artistic pursuit, right. Air quotes with artistic. And I hated math. I was terrible at math, and nobody who met me would say, well, I think she'll go into engineering, it was always like, well, of course she's going to be an English teacher. Yes, that's exactly what she's going to do. So I did, in that sort of sense, I think I always knew that I was on the sort of humanities, creative, end of the spectrum rather than, something very process oriented, which is why it's so funny to me that I've sort of ended up where I am. Mm-hmm. But I think the thing when I was going back to, the friend that I was talking to, one of the things that really kept coming up was the idea of the multi-passionate. right? Now that's something that if I had known that that was a thing when I was in middle school, I think that it would have really saved me a lot of heartache.
Can you go into that a little bit? Because I don't think we've talked about that on this podcast before, and people might not know what it is.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So the multi-passionate is somebody who is, well, they might also be called like a Renaissance soul, or and there's a lot of other phrases that aren't coming to my head. The polymath, I think that's another phrase for it.
I've heard scanner and multi-potentialite. And
multi-potentialite. Yeah, that's another one that I've heard, where you're interested in so many things. And I think a lot of it, I don't know where it comes from, but maybe it's just sort of a function of being a curious person. Right? Where you hear something and it makes you wonder more about it. But you have a lot of interest. And now that was me.
Me
always,
too.
Where I dabbled. And that became a real fundamental part of how I perceived myself, was as a dabbler. And when I was growing up, it had a very negative connotation.
Yeah.
And there was,
you couldn't settle.
Right. So I was in band, when I was in high school, and I've always been super into music. I've always been a singer, and, I would play piano by ear and do all those sorts of things. And, so when I got into high school and I joined the band, I started out playing clarinet. And I didn't really like the clarinet, so I switched to the flute. So I played the flute, and then when marching band season was around, it was the piccolo. Well, after I had been in band, the official marching band, for a year, the band director, I don't remember if he asked me directly. I think maybe he did. And he asked me if I would be interested in switching to trumpet, because he needed another trumpet. And I said, sure, I'll learn the trumpet. And I did. And it was easy, and I loved it. And I learned the trumpet. There I was. And I stayed there for a year. And then the next season rolled around, and he said, well, our French horn mellophone just graduated. Would you be interested in learning French horn and mellophone? And I said, sure. And I did. And I hated the French horn for 2 years because it was really, really hard. And then I loved it because I actually stuck with it. I remember coming home and telling my dad, I don't remember if it was when I started trumpet or when I started the French horn, but he was mad. He was legitimately angry. And he just didn't understand why I couldn't stick with something. Just stick with it. Well, I just wanted to learn something new. And not only did I want to learn something new, I wanted to like be helpful to my band teacher who I loved. He needed this. And I was like, well, yeah, I'll help you. Sure.
Somebody in authority was asking you. So I would have thought that would have given you some good cover there.
Yeah. And I loved it. I loved learning all the new things, but in the mind of the people in my family, it wasn't a positive. There was somebody in my family who, I remember distinctly, he had a lot of different jobs, and he still does. He's in his 70s now. And, he was, every few years he would switch jobs. And the way that the people in my family talked about that was they really looked down on it, and it was that notion of, well, he just can't stick with anything.
Right.
He's constantly changing his mind. And why can't he just stick with something? And it's, what feels like kind of a more old fashioned idea. I don't know whether it is or not, but it all seems sort of wrapped up in that idea of, well, you go and you find a job and you work there for 40 years and you retire. You just find the thing and you keep doing it. And this just bucks that trend.
Absolutely.
And so in my mind, it was always a really negative thing. And it was like, well, am I going to wind up like, I don't want to say the person's name, but am I going to wind up like them? And is my family going to look down on me because I keep changing paths? And that was a scary place to be. Where I felt like, well, I don't want to do that thing anymore. And I don't feel like I have to, but I know that I'm disappointing my family by changing my mind and pivoting and changing my path and doing this other thing. And I've had so many different kinds of jobs. So I for a long time, I thought that was a negative thing until I learned about the idea of being a multi-passionate person, and that there are so many people out there who are multi-passionate.
So many.
Yeah. And that it's totally normal and wonderful It's a wonderful thing to be. And, I think a lot of multi-passionates like to point to, to really famous people who obviously are multi-passionate, but it's really true. I mean, like Leonardo da Vinci is obviously a really famous example.
Yep.
Even, somebody like Justin Timberlake, who writes and dances and sings and acts and absolutely he's a multi-passionate person.
Yep.
Right. And so in so many ways, we really kind of lift them up in terms of celebrity. But then when it comes to the people in our lives, we say, oh, well, they just can't stick with anything. Nobody's saying
we have the whole,
JT.
sort of like, to go with Justin Timberlake, the idea that, you want to be a singer. Oh, well, that's for those people. Even if you just look at him as a single thing, it's like, that's for those people. But even more so when you add in all the rest of it. Yeah. It's kind of like, well, how are you going to make that work?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. So for me, I'm trying to sort of connect it back to my story. I might have to think for a second.
Sure.
So I think for me, when I was able to learn about being multi-passionate and embrace kind of what that meant for, well, one, what it kind of meant for my past, right? That, so I've had so many jobs, right? I've worked in so many different kinds of industries and I've done lots of different kinds of things. And being able to look back and say, all of those things have served me. And they all inform what I can do now. And I can use all of those things to build a business. So, I majored in English, so I know editing and proofreading. And I was a photographer and I was a barista, and I've worked in insurance, and I've been a corporate trainer, and I've worked in retail. I mean, like lots of people. And I taught English overseas, as English as a foreign language. And what else have I done? I don't know. I've done all kinds of stuff. And so when I started going to a business coach, and after, I was even then trying to kind of work out what I was going to do. And she kind of looked at me and she said, well, have you thought about being a virtual assistant? Oh, I know the other stuff. Web design. So I got certification in web design. So I did web design and all kinds of admin stuff. Oh, and I worked at doctors' offices. And anyway, and it was like this light bulb went off where I was like, oh my gosh, I can use so many skills that I've learned to do that job. And it was like all of the multi-passionate, all the different things, like they can all inform that.
Yeah, that must have been like, I don't know, like the sky opening and the sun shining, and suddenly it all makes sense.
Yeah, it really was.
So when you landed there with the coach, I mean, did that when did you actually take a different tack? When did you actually start to embrace the word creative?
That's a good question. I don't know. So like I said before, I think, I always kind of knew I was on a more creative end of the spectrum. I think maybe starting to reject the idea would have come more around like high school and college. And I specifically remember in college not identifying as a creative. I'm not sure that there was like a moment when I realized, well, I am creative. I think it was maybe more of a really long process of just kind of realizing that maybe part of it was that I didn't need to like split hairs about it. And I guess maybe, I don't know, maybe coming to an understanding that the creative doesn't have to be in a box that means you produce.
Ooh.
Because that's what I would always say. Well, I'm not creative because I don't actually make anything. I don't actually produce anything. But I think I realized at some point, and again, it wasn't like a defining moment, But I think I just realized that it didn't have to be about production, and that it's really more just about, I don't know what it's about. What is it about? You tell me, Nancy. What is creativity? Can you answer this 1,000-year-old question?
That's such a good question, because it's like it takes so many forms. But I think it's anytime you are creating something that didn't exist before. And yet, as I say that, I'm reluctant to go with it because I feel like it puts pressure on people. But it doesn't necessarily have to be a new invention or a new, object or anything like that. It could just be a new way of seeing something. It's like bring your perspective to it. You see, I hate the phrase outside the box, and yet Lord knows it works almost all the time. You're seeing outside of what everybody else is seeing. You're able to look outside the established parameters of a thing and say, what about that thing over there?
Yeah.
It's like seeing possibilities and how they might work. And you kind of like what you were talking about before when you said, your husband comes up with a bazillion ideas and you're the one who sits there and goes, okay, so these 62 aren't going to work, but these other 3, these might actually mean something and amount to something. That's just as much a creative thing, I think, because somebody has to weed through all that stuff, and somebody has to be able, unless you're the kind of person who's sitting there going, no, only the things that fit in our pre-established box will work, which I don't think is what you mean. Then, you're doing the same thing, because you're like, ooh, hang on, wait a minute, that thing, that could be really, really cool.
Yeah.
I've never seen that before. I'm not exactly sure maybe how we'd make it work, but I think we could, whatever. I think all of that is creative. And, and this is part of why it's like, if you're breathing, you're creative. I grew up with an engineer. Don't tell me engineers aren't creative. Are you kidding me?
Oh, no, you're exactly right about that. 100%.
And yet so many people think that anything that's associated with science and math is not creative, and it's just not true. We wouldn't have we wouldn't have the internet connection that we're using to record this call if it hadn't been for people who were into science and math.
Yeah.
So,
and I 100%, I'm on board with that 100%. And if I made it seem earlier when I said,
no, you didn't.
Because I know that spectrum, right. Even then I was like, not really comfortable with that idea of sort of like, well, you're one or the other, but,
it's a different kind, but
yeah. Well, and two, when you're in the school system, right, it really is, you take those dumb quizzes, right, that are like, what kind of job should you have? But you're always sort of, through the whole school system, you're always kind of being put into different little categories and boxes. And mine was never the, math box.
Right.
Even though as an adult, and so I developed a terrible math phobia for years and years and years. But as an adult, going on my own and having to figure things out, I realized I love it. But I never had the space to figure it out for myself.
Yeah.
And then when I had the space to do that, I realized like, oh, I love playing with numbers. This is great. I love figuring this problem out. But I just couldn't do it the way that they wanted me to do it. And so I was bad at that.
That's the problem with school so many times as a former teacher. It's like, you wish that you had the opportunity to sit down with every kid and take as long as it took and to find the right way to make it work for that kid.
Right.
But you don't. And the awful effect of it is that a kid gets labeled as, not very good at math, when actually in the right circumstances, they could be great at math.
Right.
I think we could all be great at anything if given the right circumstances. So
right. Yeah, everybody's working in the limitations that they have for whatever they're doing.
Yep.
But you said something, what was it you said that kind of sparked something for me? Oh, about like when I sort of realized that maybe I was creative. I think part of it too was just sort of like saying, well, 1,000 people can't be wrong, right? Like people tell me all the time that I'm creative. So what are they seeing in me that I'm not seeing in myself? And I remember being in a group of women where there was one woman who was kind of going around the room and saying like what she appreciated about each one of us. And the thing that she said about me was that I always provided a different perspective and something that she would never have thought about on her own. And that sort of reminded me of what you said, where it's like, you just sort of think about things in a different way, or you can kind of take them and, mold them around and think, well, what if we think about it this way?
Yeah. It's like a different angle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think it was kind of those things together that finally made me say, no, I'm creative. And then the other thing was I started knitting 11 years ago or so. And that really was like, oh, so I can sit and I can make something. And that, felt nice because it was productive and also like handy at the same time.
Yeah. And there's something, I mean, as much as I think it's true that being creative can be as simple as having a different angle, there is also something really, really satisfying about I made this thing that didn't exist before.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's a funny thing. Like, I'm not necessarily being like creative when I knit because I'm following somebody else's directions a lot of the time, so I don't know. It's just a funny thing, isn't it? Creativity and all of the different sort of.
It means so many things, which is why when people say to me, I'm not creative, I just kind of, usually in the name of politeness, try not to laugh right in their faces. But still, it's like, yeah, you are. You just aren't identifying it that way, or you're afraid of the word. And I think, we put so much pressure on that word. And it's, I'm not sure the word itself can really bear it, because really, if you think about it, creativity, it's kind of a vague term.
Yeah.
Right. It means so many things. It can be used in so many ways. If somebody comes up to you and says you're creative, I mean, you don't even know what they mean. When you're sitting here listening to all this going, I am really, I have no idea.
Is this an insult in this context? What are they saying? Well, aren't you creative?
But yeah, so it's like, and yet we put all this pressure on this very vague term. So, what does it mean? Does it mean you have to produce a masterpiece? Does it mean that you have to come up with 87 new ideas every 6 minutes? Does it, what does it mean? And I think a lot of people just kind of react to that and go, no, thank you. I don't want that kind of pressure. I'll go over here and count beans and I'll be fine. Thanks very much.
Oh yeah. That's a really good point. Yeah. I never even really thought about that, sort of the pressure that people place on themselves if they feel like they're supposed to be creative, right? It's just so much easier, like, not to have to thinking about it.
Yeah, because a lot of people will be, I mean, they'll literally like wave their hands, like to get it away from them. Like, oh no, I'm not creative. I'm not creative. And it's like, yeah, you are.
Oh, that's fascinating.
I mean, think about it. We all played as kids. We all imagined stuff as kids. We invented whatever, and we did it easily. It comes from nowhere. I've got nephews who are 7 and 4, and they will both come up with stuff that just, I mean, they were playing a couple months ago when I was with them, and the one walked up to me with a tray full of little blocks and said, here's some fresh gargle nut stew. And I'm like, where on earth did you get that? But it just comes out of them without a second thought, so, we all did that when we were kids. Don't tell me you're not creative. You may have forgotten how. That's a different thing. But it's still in there somewhere, because we were all that kid, who just said the first thing that came out of their mouth, no matter how crazy or insane or brilliant it was. And it just gets lost because, we're told that we have to like be practical and logical and make sense and keep creative stuff to art class or music class or whatever. It's all still in there.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good point. I've got an 8 and a 10-year-old, so I get to see it firsthand a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then, of course, I mean, my husband and I then are also very creative. But yeah, so being in a family of, of lots of ideas all the time and lots of people just saying funny things off the top of their heads, it's great.
Yeah. But, it's like the Picasso quote that now I'm going to butcher because I can't exactly remember it off the top of my head. But I think it's something like every child is an artist. The problem is how to stay one when you grow up.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, because we call that play, and we decide that we're not supposed to play anymore when we get older, when actually we should all be playing a lot more.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, kind of going back to the sort of math idea. And I think that calling it play is a really, is a really good, I like that word about it, just where you're sort of allowing yourself space. And for me, that's where I started to realize that I liked, math, or even that I liked kind of organizing things was, when I had to start sort of doing budgeting.
Right.
And I had the space. I wasn't under time constraints. I had the space to like take all of these numbers and all of these categories and play with them, right? To put them into spreadsheets and see, well, what happens if we put this one there? And if we take out a little bit and put it over there, and see how it all kind of plays together. And it was that process of having to do my family budget that made me realize, like, oh no, this is fun, right? like managing these numbers is fun. Oh, I like this. I like budgeting. I like working with numbers. Why didn't I like this for the last 25 years?
Yeah.
And it's that bringing in that sense of play and the space to allow it. I heard recently there was a mathematician who was on one of the shows on NPR. I don't remember which one it was. And he was talking about this same kind of idea, right? And he says, that there are people think that they're bad at math or they're afraid of math. And for him, it's all about like really giving people the space. Like he says that math in schools is now really about like, here's how you solve the problem. It's about teaching them the method to solve the problem before they see the problem. And so they're not learning to figure out how to solve the problem. And that, he wants to the math education to kind of come at it from a different angle where, and obviously I do understand that schools are really limited in their time.
Oh, absolutely.
And all the, and so, the idea of instituting this, sort of nationwide is not necessarily tenable, but just the idea that like, we'll show them the problem and let them figure out how they want to solve the problem, give them the space, give them the time to play with how to solve the problem. Don't show them how to solve, the one method to solve the problem. There's so many methods that you can use. And it was like, I didn't learn that until I was an adult and having to figure things out for myself, because I didn't remember the methods they taught me. I don't remember any of that. I couldn't do long division. I can't do long division. I don't remember any of that.
Yeah, I was never any good at that one in the first place.
I'm sure I wasn't either, but I figure out other ways to figure it out, right?
Yeah.
And then that's where the joy comes from.
When I was teaching, we would have conversations, around the lunch table with different faculty members, and we'd say, what was really frustrating was that there wasn't any intellectual curiosity. It was just, tell me what the answer is. Either tell me what the answer is or tell me how to get the answer. That was all there was. It wasn't, well, why do you get the answer this way? Or why is this the answer? Or what about this other thing over here? Or anything about that. And I feel like people who know me know not to get me started on standardized testing, but because I could go on for hours. But, I feel like we have this fundamental lack of critical thinking because you can't test critical thinking on a standardized test. I mean, maybe you could, but I think it would be a whole lot harder, because how do you fit it into a multiple choice answer? If you really want critical thinking to happen, it's got to be an individual answer. And so it doesn't happen because the schools are under pressure to produce test scores, and the tests are all standardized tests. And therefore you're going to get multiple choice thinking rather than critical thinking, which eventually, who's going to be the engineer and who's going to be the teacher and who's going to be the writer. And obviously we've got, millennials who are kids that I taught who are doing great things. So it's still there, it still exists, but you can also point to lots of examples where it doesn't seem to exist. And that's kind of scary.
Yeah. And so much of I think a lot of times what happens is like people in my case, right, where you start to figure things out as an adult, like we can't always figure everything out when we're in elementary school or middle school. Right. And sometimes you just sort of have to live life and figure it out in your 30s instead, which is what I did.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the critical thinking and creative thinking go hand in hand. I think, to a large extent, they overlap. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're kind of like, at this point, this person who does all of the organizational planning kinds of stuff,
Mm-hmm.
which isn't really what a lot of people think of as creative. So how do you tell me how you got there and how that works for you as a creative thing?
Okay. So I think, so by the time I was in my late 20s, I think that I had fully taken on the creative mantle, because I had at least one of my children. I don't remember if I'd had both of them. But so I was very into photography. I was doing a lot of photography. I was working, I had most recently been a corporate trainer, and that involved quite a bit of creativity. I had to do some writing, and I had to do some designing, and I had to sort of develop curriculum. And I think that took a lot of creativity. But so I had really gotten into photography, and then I was also working at a doctor's office part-time. And I decided that I wanted to go back to school to learn web design. And I did. So I found an online program and I learned web design. And I chose web design because I knew I wanted to do something kind of designing, and I wanted to do something creative. And I also knew that I wanted to work on computers, because I really enjoy working with computers. And what I didn't realize at the time was that I thought, well, I don't want to do graphic design because I want to work on a computer, having no notion of the fact at the time that, like, pretty much all graphic design is done on computers. Yep. But I didn't know that. So I thought, well, I'm going to be a web designer. And so I went back to school and I got the certification in web design. And so I had learned coding and all of that kind of stuff. And so I knew at that point, so I had both kids by that point. So I knew at that point that that our family was going to be moving from Nashville to Pennsylvania. And so I decided to get a temp job because I knew we were going to be moving. So I went on an interview, and they hired me on the spot. And this was a company that did e-learning. And they hired me ostensibly to, it was data entry that involved a little bit of coding. So because I had some design and I had some training background and I had some coding, so I was a good fit for this. And one of my bosses there, and it was a great company, and I loved my bosses, and one of the bosses that I had there, I think may have been one of the most instrumental people in sort of leading me on the path where I am now, because I'm not sure exactly what it was she saw in me. And I've never asked her, and maybe I should, but I had been working there for a few months, and she asked me if I would consider starting to take on some project management. I didn't have any idea what that was. And so I think she just sort of saw in me some capability for wanting things to be organized. And I don't know that I had any particular skill in that area. And I do honestly think, so I don't consider myself a naturally organized person at all. I am extremely scatterbrained. And I joke that I could only ever have 2 children because there's no way I would remember more than that. I couldn't possibly remember a third birthday. I'm very forgetful. It's very difficult for me to keep my mind on something. And I was actually diagnosed 2 years ago with ADHD. But at the time, I hadn't been diagnosed with anything. I just knew that I was really scatterbrained and really forgetful, and it was really hard to kind of keep my brain on track. So, but she saw something in me. And I do think that some of that need to start to figure out how to organize things. Well, I've always sort of had it, right? Because I needed to figure out a way to manage my life as a very scattered person. And so a lot of that was just sort of born out of necessity for surviving, right? Like getting through school. And I did great. I did well in school. And I think I just sort of learned these coping mechanisms. And then also having kids, that was a really big part of it. So because I had to manage a household and I had children and children are not organized and they really kind of throw things out of whack. So I had some sort of organizational capability. And I think she saw that in me, and she asked me to start sort of taking on some project management tasks. And they were very specific at the beginning. I don't even remember really what they were, but, I started taking some of that on, and then we moved to Pennsylvania. Well, I told them, I said, well, I took this temp job because we're going to be moving, and so I just want to be clear that I'm not going to be staying in Nashville. Mm-hmm. And they said, well, then would you consider working remotely, doing your same job, and we'll hire you as a full-time employee? And it's like, well, that's the easiest ever. You mean I'm going to get benefits? I'm not going to have to look for a job in our new state. And, yes. And I get to work from home. Yes, I will absolutely do that. And so I had been there for about 9 months, I think, when we moved to Pennsylvania. And so by that point, I was doing a lot of different things, which is always the case, with any job, where I was still doing a lot of the data entry. But then I started kind of managing it more, and I started managing the projects themselves to say, okay, well, this is where project A is, and these are the things that we need for the next steps to happen. And this is where project B is, and it's at a little bit of a different place. And so I started kind of learning how to manage projects in that way, and manage multiple projects, and figure out what was needed to get things, from the beginning of the process to the end of the process. Mm-hmm. And I loved it. And so I actually did a lot of training specifically for project management once I started to take on that role. And I did like classes through lynda.com, which I highly recommend. They're great. Mm-hmm. And I learned so many helpful methods for managing projects, but also managing your time, and for just how you think through processes and things like that. And it is so creative. And it was really just a light bulb moment. There was this one specific course that I took about network diagramming, which is like the awful corporate sort of, what the heck is network diagramming? It sounds terrible. But it was this method that they used, where he had like a whiteboard in front of him, and he had Post-it notes. And he would write a task on a Post-it note and put it up on the board, and then just all the tasks, put them up on the board. And then he moved them around, and he put them in order. And then he figured out how long each task needed. And then he figured out how long the whole project was going to take based on all of that information that had been done before. Mm-hmm. And that really was my light bulb moment, where I thought, this is creative, right? And it's clear, and it's kinetic, like you can move during it, and it's visual. And if this is project management, if this is organization, sign me up. I love this. And that's the same process. It's the same process that I use with my clients, because it was so eye-opening to the fact that I can learn really helpful, specific methods to organize processes, to figure out how things get done and when they're going to get done. I don't know. So I realized from that point that it really could be creative and process driven, right? And where it's like, it's really that, it's that combination, to me anyway, of that sort of engineering and creativity, right? Where those things intersect. So that was the beginning of my project management journey. And now that's what I do.
That's really cool. Because it's just so, I want to say unexpected, and yet it seems really not in retrospect, I bet. Everything sort of leads to that conclusion.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes. I told you my brain gets off track.
That's okay. That's all right. So I'm wondering though, like, because so many creative people, like, because my reaction to the idea of I'm going to sit down and do a project plan is I would sooner gouge my eyes out with a hot poker. And yet the way you're describing it does sound more interesting than what I would usually think of. So, I may be wrong about that. But for somebody like me who needs to do something like that, I mean, how would you recommend that they approach it in a way that will not make them lose their minds?
Well, I think, well, for one thing, like that is for me, that process that I just talked about is really, it's like the linchpin, and it's not everything that goes into project management. And I never went and got my PMP, project management certification, because I didn't care. I was like, I don't need that. There's a lot of like sort of really corporate or, I guess more complicated stuff that for me, it was like, oh, well, this is the process I need. So for one thing, I think it's about not getting overwhelmed with the thousands of possibilities that exist for project management, right? And it's like project management in itself, I think, is a really problematic term for creative people.
Yeah.
Because it does sound so corporate, and you hear it and all you can think is, that sounds corporate and I don't really know what it means and I hate it.
And it sounds so regimented too. Like, oh, if I have this plan, I can't deviate from the plan. And if something comes up, or if I have some, shiny new idea that I need to incorporate, I'm stuck. I can't do it. I'm trapped. I think that's what that sounds like to a lot of right-brain people. Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. And, the shiny object syndrome, I think we'll have to pause, come back to the shiny object syndrome thing, because there's just so much to be said about that. But in terms of just sort of like the process, so I teach the process. I have webinars and things like that actually walk you through how you do this process with your own project. And then I do it one-on-one with clients too, because I think, like you said, some people just think I would rather gouge my eyes out. I don't even want to learn how to do it. I just want somebody else to do it for me. And that's fine, because I totally get that too. But the idea that it was, like I said, and you being a teacher, I'm sure you're extremely familiar with this, but the sort of, kinetic learning and visual learning and auditory learning. And I think, I don't know, I think maybe some of that has been debunked in terms of you're in one of these buckets, right? You're an auditory learner. So a lot of that has been debunked. But the truth of the matter is that the more of those that we incorporate into what we learn, the better we understand it, and just kind of the more well thought out it is. Right. And so the fact that the process itself is it's tangible, right? You can do it digitally, but when I'm in person with somebody, we do it on literal Post-it notes or sticky notes. And so it's something that you can touch, and it's something that you can move, and it's something that you can see. And there's something about putting all of those pieces together that, to me, are what make it appealing to a creative person. It's what makes it appealing to me as a creative person. That it's very physical, right? Not at all just ideas that you have to remember.
It's not all just hypothetical.
Yeah, but it's really physical, and it's really motion oriented, and you can play with it. That's the other part of it too. Is it's not. You move them around however they make sense to you. And if you need to add something, you literally just move it and add it in, and so it really isn't regimented. There's a lot of room for alteration and for, figuring out more pieces of it as you go.
Yes. I think that's the part that would surprise me, kind of okay, but this thing said that it was going to take, 3 weeks and 42 hours and, well, I guess that's 4 weeks, but, and 15 minutes, and then it was going to be done. And then what happens if it's actually 4 weeks, 3 days and 12 hours and maybe a little bit more because I might still not quite be done. I guess what I'm wondering is like, to what extent are you, it sounds to me like you're not married to that chunk of time, but what happens, especially if you're a creative person who, you've come up with this plan, possibly very reluctantly kicking and screaming, you've come up with a plan, and now it doesn't seem to be going the way you had it in your head. Mm-hmm. What tends to happen with people if the plan doesn't quite mesh up with reality that way? Does it throw people off, or or is there room to say, oh, hey, that's okay, stuff happens?
Oh, no, there's definitely room to say that's okay, stuff happens. But I think what I see tripping people up is the emotional stuff that goes along with the plan not going how you expected it to go.
That makes sense.
And here's the thing. The plan never goes how you expect it to go. Even if it is...
That's kind of why I brought this up, because I thought it can't possibly be that easy.
Well, so but when you have it laid out, you can see exactly what you have to do next or what you have to do to fix it. It just makes it so much easier to course correct when you need to. But you're never locked in, right? Okay. The alternative is when you don't plan. So here's the thing. So you were talking about how, you expected it to take 42 weeks and it takes 4 or something like that, right? It was these wildly variant numbers. And the thing is, you might not be totally correct about your numbers, but if you go through this process and you lay it out, you're going to be a lot closer than you think. And it's generally not going to be something like, well, I expected it to take 14 weeks and it took 72, if you're actually going through the process and laying it out. But when you don't go through a process and lay it out, you really do wind up with those crazy numbers. Because if all you're using is, here's what happens, right? And let me know if this sounds familiar to you. Okay, let's say that you have a project that you're going to plan, or a launch, right? You have a new podcast, right? You're gonna do this podcast. You've never done it before. Right. And you say, okay, so I am going to launch my podcast in August. Because why? Because I don't have a lot going on in August, right? So I have some space. I have some time to work on it. And it's 6 weeks from now. And so yeah, I'm gonna do it in August. And you start to work, you start to do some things kind of haphazardly, and that's fine. And then you hit July 15th and you say, oh, no, I'm not going to launch this thing in August. That's not going to happen. I don't have enough time to do that. Mm-hmm. So nobody really knew about it. I hadn't put my marketing out yet. So we're going to push it to, let's say, October 1st, because I don't have a lot going on October 1st. And that's sort of the way that we think about it, right? Okay, what do I have going on around then? Does that seem like that's what I would have done? Is to say I don't have a lot going on around then. That sounds good. That feels good in my gut. So I'm going to go with it. Yeah. Right? And yeah, in my case, I had the magic deadline that said January 8th is the day. Everything happens on January 8th. Somehow between now and January 8th, you got to get it all done. And I had a coach who was sitting there going, January 8th is the day, right? So that if you have that kind of deadline, but I know it has to be an actual credible deadline. If it's just a deadline with me, it might as well not exist, right? There has to be somebody that knows that, that this is my deadline and I have to know it really is a deadline in order for that to work. Yeah. And that gets into the whole accountability piece, which again is kind of its own big conversation. Its own thing. Yeah. So like I had this client that I worked with, and we had never worked together, and she came to me and she said, my launch day is going to be February 8th. And I said, great. Okay. So let's map it out. So we mapped it out. And by the time we were done, I said, oh no, your launch date is going to be April 15th because, and it was like, oh great. Now I know, because once you like map it all out, even if the times that you think are correct aren't totally correct, you're still going to have a much better sense of when it can actually get done.
Right.
And so, in your case with the January launch date, so maybe you do make the January launch date, but how do you make the January launch date? Is it a situation where you actually are working really well in a way that feels really, really good? Or as you approach that launch date, and so here's the other piece, right? Like I had said, like you move your launch date if nobody knows about it. But if you don't have the option of moving it, then you wind up in a situation where you're working 12 and 14-hour days to get it all done, which sucks.
Yeah, I wasn't doing that, but I was spending pretty much every single weekend.
Yeah.
That was it, because there was no other time to do it.
Right. And you had to get it done because that was your day.
And I should say, I was not flying totally blind. I did have month 1, do these things, month 2, do these things, month 3, do these things. Cause it was a, this is going to happen in 90 days thing. And that was mapped out for me pretty much by my coach. So that, I wasn't flying totally blind.
Okay.
So other circumstances like grad school, there were definitely times when I would sit there and go, there's no way I can get this much work done by the time I have to mail in this packet to my advisor. And somehow it always did. And I was always amazed that it did. But it was because I had decided at the very beginning that there was not a chance in hell I was sending in a packet late.
Right.
And so, I'd be sitting there the day that I went to send it going, good grief, look at that. It's all done. How did I do that? I don't know. If you made me tell you how I did that, I couldn't tell you, but it's all done.
Yeah.
Which is when I realized that the right kind of deadline was magic. But you have a point. That was like in a 3-week chunk, and I knew what I had to do. So it wasn't like, I have to produce something in 3 weeks. It was like, I've got to read these 3 books. I have to write 3 pages about each of them. I have to produce this much of my own stuff. I have to write a letter that goes with it. And if there was anything extra on top of that, so I did know what I had to do and what I had done. And then it was just a matter of what makes the most sense to do now.
Okay. So what you did, if I can interrupt.
Go for it.
You did the first 2 steps of network diagramming.
Okay.
You just didn't know that's what it was.
My head, but yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's, and when you when I break down the process for people and when I talk about it, it almost sounds like, well, do you think I'm stupid? Of course I can do that. It's like so dumb. You're like, well, why did somebody have to tell me how to do that? Because it seems so obvious when you see it. But for some reason, or at least for me, it was like, it wasn't until I actually saw somebody do this step by step that it was like, oh my gosh, why haven't I been doing that my whole life? Right. But I mean, if you're talking about, oh, well, okay, so I know I have to take these steps and it would make the most sense to do them in this order. Well, the only thing you're missing at that point is estimating your timelines.
Alrighty. Well then. And I probably did some of that too. Probably. I could do this really quickly. This is going to take a longer amount of time, and so then do I want to do the thing that's going to take longer first because that's the biggest thing and leave the quicker stuff until later? Or would I feel better if I get one quicker thing done right now? And then at least I can check something off the list before I tackle the big thing.
Sure.
So, yeah.
And there's, obviously then there's shades of sort of differentiation for how, the best way to kind of, and I think for me, it depends on the day, it depends on the person, it depends on the project, but then of course you do have sort of all different ways, okay, so what order are you going to put them in? Are you going to put them in an order where it's like, well, let me just have a quick win, first. And, like I said, I think even those kinds of decisions can kind of depend on the day. But
yeah. And it's also which thing am I in the best mindset to do today?
Yeah. There's so much of that for sure. And so that's where, even though you have the process mapped out in a way that may feel regimented, there's always room for adjusting. And I am a huge proponent of working with your energy, with whatever your energy is for that day. I couldn't work. Yeah, I couldn't work any other way. If I am in a place where I'm super low energy and it is going to be like pulling teeth to write something or to produce some content. It's not happening. I can't do it. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there are some people who are so disciplined that they could just like push through it and do it. But I think a lot of us can't do that. And that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So just because you have this plan doesn't mean that you're not able to still work with your energy and adjust things based on whatever day. I think, when you get it all where you can see it, there's something about seeing the plan mapped out that then allows you to say, I understand the whole big picture, and I understand each small step in a way that I can see where I can adjust. I can see if I need to, take a little bit more time here and a little bit less time from there to make it all work out. And it does. But I think laying it out ahead of time is so important.
That makes a lot of sense to me. Though I feel the need as my creativity coach self to point out that if all of this sounds totally overwhelming and you're just barely managing to get yourself to write anything again or sing anything again or do whatever your thing is again, pick a tiny little step that doesn't feel overwhelming or daunting. Yeah. Pick the tiny step that you can do in your sleep, backwards, forwards, whatever. And don't worry about any of this stuff until you get to the point where you really, really need it. Just worry about getting yourself doing the thing. Mm-hmm. Cause there can be a fine line. If that's where you are, you don't want to plan like this yet because you'll make yourself crazy and you'll never touch what you're trying to get yourself back into doing.
Yeah. But even if you are planning though, that's one of the things I really love too is how you can address that sense of overwhelm, because we all hit those points. And I mean, I think maybe for somebody who like you said, is not doing anything because just that tiniest baby step is all they can do.
Right.
I'm not really sure, if you're not planning anything, then, you are where you are and that's okay. But there's just a lot that it can inform about that overwhelm and the resistance. Because at any point, you can break down whatever it is you have to do into a smaller component.
Yeah, and I was going to say it kind of is breaking things down into smaller pieces.
Yeah, it absolutely is.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, if you're just trying to get yourself to sit down and do anything, I think it'll be, more than your brain can handle. But once you get rolling again, then I can see how this could all be really, really useful.
Yeah. But I think what I'm trying to say is like the practice of breaking it down.
Oh, yeah.
Right. So like so whether you're doing this in a plan or you're not doing it in a plan because you don't feel like you're there yet, the practice of breaking down and saying, here's the next place I need to get to. Right. And maybe that next place that you need to get to is to, I don't know, finish playing a single song on the piano. It's all kind of that same process of breaking it down, right? It doesn't have to be big. A project or whatever you're looking at doesn't have to be big. So if whatever that goal is, so can you give me an example, sort of like a goal that somebody might have in this situation that you're talking about?
Well, they might, the kind of thing that I'm thinking of is say somebody really, 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 really wants to write a novel, but they either haven't written anything before, or it's been years or whatever. And they're, I have no ideas. I can't get myself, or I have an idea, but I can't get myself to sit down and write it. The first thing that I would tell them to do is just sit down at the desk for 5 minutes. You don't have to do anything sitting at the desk. You don't have to do anything at all. Just sit there at the desk to get yourself in the habit of sitting in the place where this thing can happen. And once you get over that, then pick up the pencil. Yes. If you feel compelled to write something for 5 minutes, it can be complete crap. There's no pressure associated with it at all. If you feel like writing something for 5 minutes, do it. If not, just sit there with the pencil in your hand. I mean, it's like the ridiculously small steps that you can't psych yourself out about, because anybody can sit at a desk for 5 minutes. Anybody can hold a pencil in their hand for 5 minutes and, doodle squirrely little, doodles on a piece of paper that don't have to mean anything. Anybody who's old enough to hold a pencil and make a mark on it can do this. Yes. That small.
Perfect. I love that. And so here's what I would say about that. So That's absolutely, I'm 100% in favor of that. And that's what I tell people too. And so if you're seeing it as sort of like your goal has to be something big that feel like where you can't do this process yet. So yeah, maybe you don't need to like sit down and map out the fact that you're going to sit at a desk for 5 minutes, right? You don't necessarily have to map that out, but the process of thinking about it is the same. Mm-hmm. So the goal doesn't have to be writing your novel. The goal can be, I'm going to write for 5 minutes. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's your goal. And maybe the way that you break that goal down into steps is to say, okay, so I'm going to allow myself however many days I need to just sit at the desk, like you said. And then my next step is going to be, I'm going to pick up the pencil. And it's just like you said, and it's breaking it down. And what I like to tell people is like, if you hit whatever point you hit resistance, because it happens every single time, it always happens. Then you take whatever that task is and you break it down into its little component parts. And you keep breaking it down until you look at it and you say, I can do that. And the way that I talk about it is to say, like, even if the first task that you see is open a browser window. Yep. If that's the next step that you can take, then that's your next step.
That's it.
And you don't have to go further than that.
Yeah. And it will feel ridiculous at some point, if not at every point, because you'll be sitting there going, any idiot can do this. But that's the point. Any idiot can do it, which means you can do it. Mm-hmm. And so whatever it is that you're having trouble getting around, that's how you do it. You break it into such tiny pieces that you cannot psych yourself out about them, because anyone could do them.
Yes.
And that, you know, I think it's really important to just be super clear that this is not saying that you're stupid. It's not saying that, you know, you're incompetent. It's saying you've got some kind of fear or overwhelm going on, and this is how you get around it. This is how you put the amygdala to sleep long enough to get around that thing that scares you. And once you get around it, then you build confidence around it, and then it's not such a big deal anymore. Though you may have the same issue every time you start a project. It may be, oh, Lordy, here I am again, because, you know, the blank page is terrifying. Whatever your version of the blank page is for whatever project you're doing, it's terrifying. And that's how you get around the fear of there's nothing on the page. I mean, there are people who would sit down and just for 5 minutes write crap, just to have words on the page. They don't have to say anything. They don't have to make any sense, but they're there. And then the page isn't blank. Mm-hmm. And then they've got something and they aren't feeling like, I have to put something brilliant on this blank page. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's not, You'll notice we are not being judgmental about this, because this is how it works. This is how you get around that crazy stuff that says to you, I can't do this.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then it also just kind of goes to show that, like, the way that you think about, if you don't, you know, have my same background, and thinking about planning a project makes you want to gouge your eyes out. And that a big part of that can be because it feels overwhelming and it feels like you're supposed to be doing something big. Well, like, what's the point of planning it out if I'm not doing something big? But it doesn't have to be that way. And like I said, a lot of it is just sort of the way that you think about what's my next step.
Right.
Right. And I wanted to go back a little bit. We had started to talk a little bit about like what happens when people kind of hit those points where they don't know how to move forward, or so in terms of like kind of the emotional baggage that comes with when the plans break down, right? And I see this a lot where people they know that they can like come back to me if they have questions, and they don't do it. They know that I'm there and I'm available, but they don't contact me. And I think it's because they have this guilt about the fact that it's gone off the rails, or the fact that, well, they started to get interested in something else. And I think if people can realize that, one, it happens to every person.
Yep.
Two, it happens in pretty much every project. You are not alone in deciding that, you know, and feeling like something has gone off the rails. Mm-hmm. So if you're able to let go of the guilt about it and realize that at any point where you get tripped up or you get stopped, there is still a way to move forward. And, you know, I would say, like, Right. And maybe you don't know how to move forward. And, that's where people like me hopefully can kind of come in and help troubleshoot. But there is always a way forward. You have to just let go of the guilt about the project not going exactly the way you thought it would, because it never will.
The guilt, the shame, the fear, all of it. It's perfectly normal.
Yeah. And still going through this process, it doesn't make this process useless. It still is useful to be able, people, when I work with people and they'll say like, oh my gosh, I feel so much better. But then they also say like, I'm also really daunted at the same time. So you do have both sides of that coin, but being able to see it laid out and just know like, oh my gosh, I know exactly what I have to do. It just works wonders.
That's fantastic. This is really cool.
Thank you so much, Nancy.
You're welcome. Thank you. That's our show for this week. Thanks again for joining me, and to Kate for sharing her insights with us. You can find show notes, the 6 creative beliefs that are screwing you up, and more at fycuriosity.com. I'd also love for you to join the conversation on Instagram. You'll find me at fycuriosity. Follow Your Curiosity is produced by me, Nancy Norbeck, with music by Joseph McDade. If you like Follow Your Curiosity, please subscribe, rate, and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends. It really helps me reach new listeners. See you next time.